Good evening and welcome. I'm Terry Sanchez. I'm part of the programming staff here. And on behalf of the Newport Beach Public Library, welcome to this evening's program featuring Chris Epting and his book, Rock and Roll in Orange County. I want to make sure to thank the Friends of the Library. Their generous sponsorship is what allows us to have these author lectures. So thank you to the Friends. And wanted to also let you know that we will have Chris's books for sale at the conclusion of the program. They're $19 each, so they'll be available for purchase and signing after the program. Well, I am thrilled to get to introduce Chris tonight. Chris Epting is an award-winning author and journalist. He was an LA Times staff writer for a decade. He wrote for the Huffington Post, as well as many other publications, and has authored over 30 books. He loves to write about things that he loves, including travel, music, baseball, American history, and popular culture. He has written memoirs for Leif Garrett, Def Leppard's Phil Collen, and John Oates of Hall & Oates. He is a gifted speaker, as we've already gotten a little taste of, and he's an author that we at the library have really been looking forward to hosting. So please join me in welcoming Chris Epting.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay on this mic, or is that one better? That's okay? Let me turn this up a little bit. Thank you very much, Sherry. I want to thank the library staff here, too. Does everybody here kind of live in the area, Newport-based? You have a great library. I live in Huntington Beach, and there's a nice library there as well. But I've come to programs here myself, and I can just tell you my experience in getting to know the staff leading up to this. It's as professional as it gets, and you're lucky to have a place that facilitates lectures and events like this. So thank you very much for having me. Really. Libraries, if you haven't noticed, are like an endangered species in a lot of communities, which is a really scary thing. Because libraries are more than just places, for books. They're places for learning and thinking and exchanging ideas and stuff. And again, when you walk into this library here, you really get a sense of what's gone into it. So you're really fortunate if you live here to have this space. So anyhow, with that, as you heard, my name's Chris Epting. I write about things that I'm really passionate about. When I was a kid, I had the benefit, when I was in the 4th grade, I decided I wanted to be a writer. I had this teacher who had read a little story that I wrote, and she called my mom. I got home, and if a teacher calls your mother, it's either really good or really bad. And this was a teacher I adored. And she said, Chris wrote this story, and he really seemed to enjoy the assignment. You should encourage him, in writing. And I remember when my mom told me that, I thought, if this teacher who, I speak at schools a lot, and I always tell kids, find that one teacher that'll change your life. This is the one that did it for me. If she felt I could write, I said, well, I'm going to be a writer. And my parents said, well, that's great. It's a very noble thing to want to be. And they said, we have a writer who lives kind of not too far. I lived in Westchester County, New York, about an hour north of New York City, in the woods. It was really pretty. And they said, we have a writer who lives nearby. You should write him for some advice. That was my parents, if you want to do something. Even at 4th grade, it's like reach out and sort of, get to it sort of thing. And I wrote this guy a letter and just said, hey, I want to be a writer. Maybe someday could you answer some questions? And his name was John Cheever. If you know John Cheever. Now, my parents were big John Cheever fans, and I didn't know I knew we had all his books. He was like a little library, and I wrote him this letter, not knowing who it was, but my parents thought it was a good idea. And a couple of days later, my mom comes in holding an envelope like it's radioactive. She's like, it's from John Cheever. And so I opened the letter, and it says word for word. I'm going to get to this in a second, by the way. If you've seen me speak, you know that I like little off-ramps and asides and having more of a conversation than like a speech with notes and stuff. I don't really plan a lot. I just kind of feel the room. Anyway, the letter says, Dear Chris Epting, it is nice to know there's another writer living in the neighborhood. One day, I'll give you a call, we'll take a walk and talk about writing. Sincerely, John Cheever. Now, that to me is what was supposed to happen. If you wrote somebody, they wrote you back. But my parents' reaction was really over the top. And about 2 days later, my mom comes in holding the phone like it's radioactive. It had rung. And she said, he's on the phone. John Cheever is calling. So I got on the phone, and he was very nice. And if you don't know John Cheever, look him up. He's really one of the lions of American literature, fiction writing. And he invited me to his house. I went the next day. And the way I tie it into this is when I went to see him, this started, again, 4th grade, I go into his house. His wife lets me in. They live in this really beautiful kind of colonial house set back from the road off of Cedar Lane. And my parents smoked like everyone else's parents back then, Marlboros. But what I saw John Cheever do in his office was he was opening a pack of what were Chesterfields, filterless cigarettes, which I'd never seen. And he opens the whole pack and he laced the whole pack out on this table. And I was there for 2 hours. One match went through the whole pack. Like he was such a chain smoker, he would just light one and light one. But as we sat there, that first, he became a mentor of mine till he died for about 7 or 8 years. But what he always told me was that, he goes, writing is, if you want to be a writer, that's a wonderful thing. It's a lot of hard work and it's very lonely. It's very isolated. When you write, you're in your own little space. He goes, the real fun, the enjoyment of what you'll have is when you go out and talk about it. If that's what you grow up to do. And that's what I always feel doing something like this. This is really the fun part. I never understand writers that get freaked out about going out and speaking, because this is where you see people that are interested in books and like to hear good stories. So that's my way of saying thank you for coming tonight and just being a part of this, because you make it possible to do this kind of stuff. So I really appreciate it. And now on with, like I said, I love music. We were talking about first shows, and I'm going to ask a couple of you your very first show. Mine was June 22nd, 1975 in New York City. I was 12 years old. I was a Rolling Stones freak. This is a picture from that night. That's Mick Jagger on opening night in Madison Square Garden, and I still kind of measure my life on either side of this night. We all are old enough to remember a pre-MTV world where the only way to see musicians was to go see musicians. Maybe you read Cream magazine or Circus or Rolling Stone, but you had to see them, to see flesh and blood, and they were sort of godlike. I remember going to see Led Zeppelin in 1977, and I remember thinking, wow, like I'm breathing the same air as Jimmy Page and Robert Plant, because back then they were so monolithic, you couldn't just go see them. They weren't on television to any great degree. And this night for me, seeing the Rolling Stones was like, I don't remember what I had for lunch yesterday, but I can recount every second of this show. I remember it in very bright, vivid detail. Just by who remembers the first show they saw as concerts? Just if I can ask a couple, what was your first one?
Kiss and AC/DC on December 12, 1977.
Okay, December 12th, 1977, Kiss and AC/DC. Where?
The Capitol Center, Orlando, Maryland.
So Kiss would create openings like AC/DC, Rush. A lot of bands got their start opening for Kiss. That's an awesome one. Who's got one too? Yes? 1969. Anaheim.
Center. On the bill was Bee Gees, Spanky and Our Gang, and Vanilla Fudge.
Bee Gees, Spanky and Our Gang, and Vanilla Fudge at the Anaheim Convention Center, which I'm going to talk about. One more over here, just first concert. Jethro Tull to Perform. Remember what year? Probably 72, 73. First concerts, I think, are like first ball games. I'm a big baseball fan, but the first really matters. That's sort of where when you went to the first show, just the air in an arena, it was a different kind of experience. And I'm glad we're all kind of like-minded. I went to 1977 now. I'm a sophomore in high school, and there was this girl I really had my eye on. Her name was Stacy Glacier, and she was really pretty, and she was a Deadhead. And I didn't really know what that meant, because by 1977, I was still a Stones freak. I had sort of started seeing, there was a new kind of music movement in New York City, which I'll get to, but she invited me to go see the Grateful Dead at Englishtown Racetrack in New Jersey. And I didn't want to go. I really didn't want to go, because to me, the Dead, I had a real overly simplistic view of what Deadheads were. I knew some in high school, and it didn't really, mesh with them that well, but we went. This is that day. And it was kind of a crazy day. It was really hot, typical kind of East Coast, muggy, rainy, and I was miserable. It didn't really go with Stacy the way I was hoping it was going to go. And I wandered off by myself and made my way, there's 300,000 people, made my way through the throngs. And if I remember, it was the New Riders of the Purple Sage opened up, then the Marshall Tucker Band, and the Grateful Dead. And this is a shot from that day. And I worked my way up to the stage. And I kind of literally hung over kind of the front barricade, and I watched the show, and I was mesmerized. And that day, I won't say I became a Deadhead, but I began to understand why the Grateful Dead were as good as I came to really believe they were. They were a lot, what was interesting to me watching them up close is they were a lot more of a rock and roll band that I ever gave them credit for. And they're playing Chuck Berry songs. And this to me, again, we all have moments that we grew up, shows that affected us. This for me was a big one. As I mentioned earlier, there was a place in New York City called CBGB's. It was a little club down on the Bowery in Bleecker Street in New York. And a friend's older brother brought me and a friend there in the winter, I think, of 1976. There were about 8 people in there. It was late. And there was this band called the Ramones that were playing. And, you know, we went in there, and I think they had just signed. I think the first record was just out. But it was like a freight train on this bitter winter night, 10 below. We go into CBGB's, which was anybody ever go there before? It was like a cave. You went to CBGB's? Wow. And this to me was an epiphany, and I started going to this place all the time. This was a period where for $2 you could see Blondie and Patti Smith and Television and Talking Heads and the Ramones especially. And this to me, from a growth experience, was a really big deal. I loved this environment. I loved this music. That was CBGB's back in about 1975. It's no longer there, but John Varvatos, who took it over, if you go in there, it's one of his clothing shops, but he was really kind of cool how he kept the integrity of the place. The stage is still there, and I'm glad they didn't just sort of get rid of the building. So I love that place. So again, my Rolling Stones thing, in 1978, there's a meeting called at lunchtime. I went to this private Catholic high school up in Summers, really pretty school on this lake, not a big school. And this girl calls a few of us together for this really kind of ultra under the radar meeting during lunch. And her mom was a big realtor up in Westchester County. And she says, look, you can't share this, but my mother just sold a house to Keith Richards. I was kidding, like this was, Keith Richards. And she was, I'm going to tell you guys where it is, but you can't screw this up. You can, you'll know where it is, but you can't this can't get out. You can't talk about it. And this was me and 3 guys who were like, the Stones, it was like our religion, it was really what we lived for, the Rolling Stones. So she takes us to this house. This sets off for about a year. We stalk this house. And what was interesting, it wasn't a house really set back. It was on the road. It was in a town called South Salem. And we would go there and hang out and look for clues and things. And I had a friend, one of my friends was he didn't believe it was Keith Richards' house, right? And what happens is there's, this picture's in People magazine, right? Not long after the under the table meeting in the cafeteria at Kennedy High School. And this tire swing, was right by the driveway, right? And that was our proof, seeing Keith Richards and his son Marlon on that tire swing. So what we would do is we would come up with reasons to go knock on the door. Maybe like my younger sister was selling like a Girl Scout cookie thing. We would go and knock and hoping he might open the door. He never did. There was a nanny who did, but his kids were always there. There was an Andy Warhol portrait of Keith Richards hanging over the fireplace. When the door opened, you could look into the world of Keith Richards. And it was teenager. It was, again, pre-MTV world. These were gods, And so now I enter my senior year of high school, and we're going to get to Orange County. I know, it's like... I do have to watch the clock. There is a time thing here. But this will be worth it. This was a real rite of passage because we all go away to school in 1979. And it's like that when you leave high school, and it was going to be a big deal. So we've done this crap for a year. He's never there. In a barn in the back, you can sometimes hear music kind of pulsating out. I remember one time there was like a greenhouse off on the side that had photos of Mick Jagger that had been developed there. They were hanging with clothespins, and you could see him on the property. So there's all these signs and clues, but no actual flesh and blood. So we make one more kind of mission of mercy to go to the house, knock on the door, this whole routine. On this particular last day, it was that my car had overheated, right? The best we had. We'd run through every other system and knock on the door, and there's no answer this time. But a guy, this young guy, it looked like he was in his 20s, he comes around the corner, and he was wearing a sheep herder's frock, and he has a staff, like a sheep herder, like Moses. And he's totally cool. He comes around, hey guys, what's going on? And we saw car is overheating and the whole thing. And he's looking, he goes, no, hold on. He goes and he gets a jug of water. He couldn't have been any more accommodating. And we're like, and he's looking, he goes, I think your water's okay. He knows about cars too. He's like, your water looks good, everything. He's checking the oil. We're like, we said, look, we're going to just drop all pretext here. Is Keith Richards home? Like, we just totally come clean. And his demeanor kind of changed. He says, guys, look, he says, you can't do this, okay? He goes, he's not here, but if he was here, he would probably get pretty freaked out that we don't think anyone knew that he lived here, you know? He says, so, but he's very reasonable, and we're like, you know what? This is sort of a fitting end to what we've been doing for the past year, right? So we, kind of head slung down, and now we're off going to be going to college in a couple of weeks. A couple of days later, my friend Bill Smith calls me, and he's got like real panic in his voice. And there's this article about a young guy who committed suicide in the house, and it was the guy that had brought us the water. His name was Scott Cantrell. He was 17 years old. He was our age. And what the story was is he was working as a caretaker in the house and had kind of fallen under the spell of Anita Pallenberg, Keith Richards' wife, and they kind of had a little affair thing, and he couldn't deal with it, and he killed himself. And this was like I remember thinking, wow, like it's the Rolling Stones, they always had that reputation that not everybody escapes, and I remember being like 18 years old thinking, wow, this is what happens if you get too close to this. So it was really a very dark kind of thing, and it was another aspect of the band that really kind of changed how I looked at them for a while. So anyway, that was that. I got older. I wrote books like this, Led Zeppelin Crashed Here, which is sort of a rock and roll road trip around the country to where stuff happened. I do a lot of photography. When I write about artists today, I like to photograph them as well to help me kind of get closer to what they're about. This is a portrait I shot of Steven Tyler for a piece I wrote on him, Ozzy Osbourne, Lou Reed. For me, it's really exciting as a writer to get older and to have time spent with these people that just made you crazy as a kid. The people that you listen to driving in your black Duster, in my case, cranking this music through the night. It's always a real thrill to sit and spend time with these people. Stevie Nicks was I still have this crazy crush on her. And I had done a piece on Fleetwood Mac a number of years ago. And when I went in, Stevie Nicks said, she goes, well, you don't have notes. And I said, well, no, I don't use notes. I just sort of, it's kind of like tonight, you know what I mean? I just sort of talk and hope that it goes okay. And she goes, well, I like that. I don't like having people kind of sitting looking at the notes. And we had a really good conversation and all. I was writing it for, I think, AOL Music. And about a year later, her publicist called me. She goes, you know what? Stevie's got this new documentary coming out. She wants to do like 1 or 2 interviews. And she enjoyed your exchange a year or 2 ago. And she'd like you to go to her house and kind of do this thing with her. We're going to videotape it and all. And you got to understand, when I was like 14, 15 years old, Stevie Nicks to me was like just sort of the high priestess of, because she was artsy and beautiful, the witch thing. I mean, to a lot of us teenage boys, I still haven't really gotten over it, and so, and my son, who's right there, has a similar, he's like me. So Charlie and I went up there and spent this day. Stevie Nicks in her house, it was up in the Pacific Palisades. It was like the lady that never gets any company, so that when you show, she doesn't want you to leave, you know what I mean? It's like someone that hasn't been around people. It was really interesting. So she and I kind of do our thing for a couple of hours. The film crew leaves, and she goes, well, you guys aren't leaving, are you? And I said, no, I'm here, you tell me. I'm here for the duration. I'm not. And she says, okay, well, sit, and she makes tea, and she goes, I have artwork you haven't seen my artwork, and I need 2 kind of strong people to get it up. And so Charlie and I are unloading her paintings out of her closet. We're there for hours and hours. And it's this really amazing night, where we're treated to her not really being Stevie Nicks, you know what I mean? Not being out in the public, not being part of Fleetwood Mac, but just being this very artistic, energized person with these great dogs and cats and everything. And so, like I said, sometimes life just takes you in these really funny places. I think if you're passionate about certain things, you get lucky sometimes, and you wind up in these spaces that you could never imagine being in. So anyhow, getting back to, traveling the country. Has anybody been to Sun Studios before? One gentleman, I think, played here at Sun Studios. We have a former member of the Wrecking Crew here. Sun Studios is an amazing place down in Memphis. There's an X in the floor where Elvis first sang, where he stood. If you've ever driven through Iowa out in Clear Lake, anybody ever been here where Buddy Holly's plane came to rest? These are the places that really get me. When you're out in the middle of nowhere, it's kind of like where James Dean died. And there's this sort of very makeshift tribute to where Buddy Holly's plane came to rest in 1959, taking he and Richie Valens and the Big Bopper, of course. If you go up to Woodstock, New York, there's a marker there where the stage used to be. I like, in books that I've written, I like kind of taking album covers and sort of recreating what's there today. Crosby, Stills and Nash, if you go West Hollywood, it's not there anymore, but that's where it would have set against a house. One of my favorite albums is After the Gold Rush by Neil Young. I remember walking in Greenwich Village along 4th Street, and I'm like, this wall looks familiar. As it turned out, that was just the wall, where he had passed by. It was kind of fun. And that gets us tonight to rock and roll in Orange County. I'm from New York originally. I've lived in Orange County for 20 years. And what always struck me at Orange County, whether it was baseball or music, I never felt like the county got the credit that it was due for what's happened here. Anybody here grow up in Orange County? Pretty good number of you. Orange County to me, there's this kind of snobbery from LA County, which I never really understood. And after I moved here, I thought, well, Orange County to me has a lot more going for it than LA, and a cultural history that is really that's untold. And that frustrated me because there are all these great stories. So, typically for me, that's my cue to get involved and try and dust these stories off and just do like we're doing tonight. Hopefully you'll hear a couple of things tonight that you don't know about that you might leave here and share tomorrow at work or at home. And that's how a lot of these stories grow and continue, as people like you will hear something that interests you and you pass it along. That's really how history goes on. So with that, I mean, who remembers watching? I was too young. I was 3. 1964, Beatles and Ed Sullivan. Good number of you. A lot of musicians will name that night. They say that after they performed, 10,000 bands were formed in America, And what's interesting is there's an Orange County connection to that Beatles appearance. If you look at the guitar John Lennon is playing, and you know what kind of guitar that is? It's a Rickenbacker. Rickenbacker is an Orange County company. That guitar was made in Santa Ana. Rickenbacker's been there since the 1930s. And I saw that, I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. You know what I mean? I know we're going to talk about Leo Fender in a second, but I never knew that Rickenbacker was an Orange County story. So right there, you start to get these interesting little connections with Orange County and some, serious rock and roll history. John Lennon there with the Rickenbacker. And again, I went over there, and that's their original logo, and they have been in Santa Ana, I think, since 1933. Now, this man, as this ad says, started a revolution. Anybody here ever meet Leo Fender? Leo Fender was born and raised in Fullerton. In the 1930s, he ran a radio repair shop in Fullerton, and he was very good with electronics. People would come to him, and he began getting involved in building public address systems. And then, as the big band era started to kind of wind down and become more kind of smaller combos, those artists needed to still project sound. And so, as the ad here says, the world has changed significantly due to the labors of this man, Leo Fender. Music was revolutionized when he invented and introduced the world's first solid-body electric guitar and basses. He went on to create and introduce tradition-shattering instruments and amplifiers, building a company that today is the world's leading manufacturer of amplifiers and electric guitars. I mean, if Fender, all of the guitars, whether we're talking about the Stratocasters that Keith Richards played, there's a nice exhibit, by the way, in the Fullerton Museum, a permanent exhibit, if you're ever over there, that does a real nice tribute to him. But when you think about the guitars played by Hendrix and Clapton and Keith Richards, those were made in Fullerton, where the factory used to be, and it's really, again, there are books written about Leo Fender. We could talk for 3 hours just about Leo Fender and not scratch the surface, but it's a very integral part of Orange County. I mean, sadly, the factory's not there anymore. Clapton, of course, playing a Stratocaster. He's laid to rest in Orange County, and at the site, there's a parking lot next to the train station. And with what I do with the kind of books, I get used to a lot of parking lots. I mean, it's like many places, as Joni Mitchell famously wrote about, they pave paradise and they do this. But they did actually honor, that is the site where the guitars were made. It's a 3-story parking garage next to the train station. Sad it's not there, but again, you can still go and kind of just get a sense of what used to be there. Next, I want to talk about this guy right there. Well, actually, his family. There was a group, the first band in Orange County in the late 1940s, literally the first band was called the Rhythm Rockers. Have you heard of them at all? Some of you know. The Rhythm Rockers were from Santa Ana, and they were essentially a family. was a number of brothers led by Barry Rillera, who's holding a bass right there, and his brothers and some friends and things. The Rhythm Rockers in the late 40s, early 50s became the band that would play all throughout the county, LA and Los Angeles, parties, house shows, whatever. They were really proficient, but Barry Rillera was somebody, the band leader, and a very innovative guitar player. And I want to tell you what happens with the Rhythm Rockers. So the Rhythm Rockers are playing at a place. Did anyone here ever go to the Harmony Park Ballroom? Did you really? Over in Anaheim. It was built in the 40s. There was a radio show done there, and they would have country western music. The Rhythm Rockers became the house band at Harmony Park. In the mid-50s, they played there 3 nights a week, drew big crowd, got paid good money there. And one night in the mid-50s, there was a black R&B singer named Richard Berry up in LA, and he came down to hear them. And that's Richard Berry right there. Now I'm going to see if this works. Richard Berry was writing a song, and he was frustrated because he was a big fan of the Rhythm Rockers. In fact, he asked them if he could sit in and sing at the Harmony Park, and they said sure. He went down there early though, and he said to Barry Rillera, look, I can't finish writing this song. There's a song that you guys play. I want to see if this plays here. This was part of the repertoire of the Rhythm Rockers. Does that sound familiar at all? So Barry says, yeah, we play this tune, and Richard Berry says, I might want to sort of pinch that and add it to this song that I'm working on. So what we get now, you know where this is going. Richard Berry goes home, and the song Louie Louie was actually born in Anaheim in the dressing room at the Harmony Park Ballroom. That's where they finished writing the song he was working on. And the Harmony Park is gone now. I went and actually got, again, me with my real specificity of wanting to go to the exact site. I got the old Sanborn fire maps and figured out where the backstage room was, where the song was written. I took Barry Rillera there. I used to do this TV show called Forgotten Orange County on PBS, where I would go and kind of find little out-of-the-way places. And he and I went there in this episode, and I knew where the spot. Again, it's a parking lot, of course, but I knew the exact piece of that parking lot where Louie Louie was born. So here you've got the ultimate garage classic, which is a product of Orange County. That, to me alone, is really substantial, that very few people knew about before I started embarking on these kinds of musical adventures. So, and again, the Kingsmen, of course, had the most famous version of it in the early 1960s. Okay, next we know who this is, right? Anaheim High School and Santa Ana High School, the Righteous Brothers. So the Righteous Brothers, Bill Medley and Mr. Hatfield, they become very popular very quickly. Phil Spector falls in love with them. The Rhythm Rockers are kind of have such a reputation, but again, it's Barry Rillera who's really the guy, and they love Barry Rillera. And they actually hire him out of the Rhythm Rockers to be their musical director. So that sort of takes care of the Rhythm Rockers, and they go on the road opening for the Beatles on the Beatles' first tour of America, the Righteous Brothers. And so Barry's still around, and he told me this story. Now, Barry did a thing back then called note bending. If you play guitar at all, that he really developed the art of sort of sustaining, created almost an ethereal sound. He would string his guitar with banjo strings, very thin strings, which allowed him to bend notes and create this sound. He told me that on this tour, when the Beatles were waiting backstage to go on, they had a little monitor in their dressing room, and they would listen to the Righteous Brothers set to give them kind of an idea of when they were going to go on. And in addition to doing that, they could hear what Barry was doing, this bending. And he said that John Lennon and George Harrison were like, wait, what the hell is that sound? So one night on the band plane, somewhere over America at 35,000 feet, Beatles rode in front, everybody else in the back. Barry is sleeping in the back row with the Righteous Brothers. And he gets woken out of his sleep. And Barry, to this day, is a very quiet, very modest guy. Does anybody know Barry at all? I mean, pulling stories out of him is like pulling teeth. But he told me how he's, rousted out of his sleep, and there in front of him are George Harrison and John Lennon. And they're saying to him, how do you get the sound that we hear every day? And they pull his guitar out of the overhead compartment, and they make him give a clinic on the plane. So you hear, Barry says, he goes, if you listen to things like While My Guitar Gently Weeps, there are certain Beatle moments where he really thinks it's connected to that night on the plane. So now you've got this Orange County product, Barry Rillera, affecting sounds of the Beatles because of this, this wonderful tour those guys did. And it's another, it's funny, Barry, he and I became kind of good friends through this, and That's him today. He'd play a little restaurant in Huntington Beach, this little steakhouse. It's no longer there. And nobody knew this guy's pedigree. He's a really amazing guy, a wonderful, very well-respected player, and a very humble guy that has wonderful stories. I think he should write a book sometime. Moving along, so the Rendezvous, anybody ever go to the Rendezvous Ballroom? Not too far from where we are now. So what music was born at the Rendezvous? Surf music, exactly. And that's thanks to, again, it's no longer there, but that's a postcard from the Rendezvous. And who's this? Dick Dale. So Dick Dale, the sounds of, if you didn't know, he was born in Beirut, actually. His two passions were to create a new music for surf culture. And this is really, again, when you look at what happened in Orange County in terms of musical styles, surf music was born, again, it's an Orange County story. Not just at the Rendezvous, but primarily at the Rendezvous Ballroom. And again, there have been wonderful books and documentaries made about Dick Dale and the Deltones and the sounds. Did anybody ever see Dick play at the Rendezvous? No. You did. Would you stand up for 1 second, sir? John, right? This guy was in the Wrecking Crew. You know the crew, the most famous session musicians. I didn't know that before tonight. He introduced himself to me before, but when you have music royalty in the room, it's nice to acknowledge it. And so again, so we have Dick Dale creating this. There were tying back to Leo Fender. Dick Dale said, I met Leo Fender, who is the guru of all amplifiers, and he gave me a Stratocaster. He became a second father to me. These are some of how the musical relationships in Orange County helped shape what became rock and roll history after that. And if you go there today in Balboa, of course, the Rendezvous Ballroom is no longer there, but there is a plaque marking the site where surf music was born. This guy on the right, Dean Torrance, lives in Huntington Beach, if you don't know. He's a great guy. He's kind of an ambassador for the city. He wrote a very good memoir a couple of years ago. We've become good friends. His partner, Jan Berry, had a terrible car accident on Dead Man's Curve in Sunset, which essentially ended their career back in the 1960s. And there were places all throughout Orange County, the Newport High School Stadium, where the Beach Boys first started, where Jan and Dean would play. There was a place called the Retail Clerks Auditorium, which is still there. Anybody ever see music there back in the day? Of course you did. That's what it looks like today. There was a place called the Marina Palace that was on Coast Highway near 2nd Street, kind of near the Long Beach, Seal Beach border. Anybody ever go there? It was a series of Quonset huts. If you drive by there today, the concrete pads, the ruins are still there. This was a real seminal music venue in Orange County. Buffalo Springfield played there, Ike and Tina Turner. I interviewed Alice Cooper. He talked about playing there, and that's what it looks like today. So there's no plaque or marker, but again, it's sort of haunting to think about what took place on that concrete pad there. Again, all part of Orange County history. Any guesses who this is? This is a Fullerton musical legend, Sunny Hills High School. Jackson Brown. Again, these are people and legends that are born here and grow up here, but that people aren't aware. You can grow up in Orange County and not necessarily understand who comes from here and what they went on to do and how they went on to change the world. Somebody mentioned the Anaheim Convention Center. The Anaheim Convention Center was really one of the premier musical venues. It was interesting because who saw shows there back in the day? This was a venue. It wasn't like the Forum, it wasn't like Madison Square Garden. It was smaller. It was several thousand people. But it really was one of Orange County's first premier musical venues that would attract. Led Zeppelin on their first tour of America played here. Elton John on his first tour, he played there. There are wonderful stories. This is the Doors playing there. You can see Jim Morrison right there. In 1968, exactly. Led Zeppelin with Jethro Tull. At the Anaheim Convention Center. Cream with Spirit. These are the things when you mention, back in the day where these bills of bands were so incredible, what you could see for several dollars back then. Okay, now whoever went to, in addition to rock and roll, when the folk music scene began growing in the early 1960s, late 50s, Orange County also had a very active folk scene. There was a place called Prisoner of Socrates in Balboa, the Paradox in Tustin, where Steve Martin started, the Rouge et Noir in Seal Beach. Anybody ever go to folk music venues in Orange County? What's interesting about it is that, believe it or not, Disneyland, there was a thing called the Hootenanny Disneyland. The Hootenanny at Disneyland is usually credited today with helping to save the country bluegrass movement in the United States because it was dying in the mid-'60s. It hit a point where artists couldn't make money. And Disneyland, with their Hootenanny series, paid good money. They put artists up in a really nice hotel there at the park. And if you look in the book that I did, I print some of these kind of season series. And this is where you see Johnny Cash, Glenn Campbell, up-and-coming artists at that point being able to perform. You can see here John Denver, the Legendaires, and again, so Disneyland, you never think of them as being integral in helping to shape musical forces, but they really were because they paid good money to artists that needed good money at that time and really helped artists like Kenny Rogers, Emmylou Harris get over that initial hump of becoming professional musicians. Went on for about 3 or 4 years. Thousands of shows at Disneyland. And again, it's something we don't really equate with Disneyland, but they were very important. No one went to the Newport Pop Festival, did they, in 1968? Did you go? Who do you remember seeing play there?
I think it was Saturday, and it was Country Joe and the Fish. And
So we're looking at the Tiny Tim, Sonny and Cher, Country Joe. This is where the Orange County Fairgrounds is today. This is where this festival was held.
I know some of the things got switched around.
Yeah. Do you remember enjoying the show, though? This is a year before Woodstock.
Hot, it was boiling.
This was really in our country where Monterey Pop had been held the year before. We hadn't really figured out the festival thing yet. This is the birth of what we see today of really big rock and roll festivals. And it was right, again, these were huge shows. Here we see, that's the founder, the guy that put it together, 25 years old, a guy named Mark Robinson, put together the Newport Pop Festival. And that's, Magic Harper, Steppenwolf playing at the Newport Pop Festival. And that's Jerry Garcia playing with the Grateful Dead. If you didn't know, Robert Hunter, the Grateful Dead lyricist, died, I just believe, 2 days ago. And that's Garcia playing right here on the Orange County Fairgrounds. Okay, Linda Ronstadt. My personal favorite. We'll get to the Golden Bear in a second. Linda Ronstadt started out hanging out at the Troubadour in Los Angeles, where a lot of early artists did. And, she had left the Stone Ponies, but she was booking gigs as a solo artist, but had nobody to really back her. Well, she gets booked at Disneyland, like a lot of artists. There was a thing called the Tomorrowland stage. If you know where Space Mountain is today, that used to be the Tomorrowland stage. And it was a very elaborate stage that would emerge from subterranea and come up. Some of you may have seen it. And she was booked there, but she had nobody to back her. So she pulls together some guys at the Troubadour. One of them is Don Henley. One of them is Glenn Fry. Can you guys help me out? I'm playing 5 nights down there. Can you come down? They said, what the hell? So they go down there and they play behind her at Disneyland. That was the Tomorrowland stage. And she says, you guys together are freaking amazing, It's Bernie Ledden. And they're saying, we like playing behind you too, but they developed their own sort of special magic playing behind her. And so what you have happening on the Tomorrowland stage is the birth of the Eagles as Linda Ronstadt's backup band, which again is another really important moment in Orange County rock and roll history that I don't think people are aware of what happened. I'm going to Disneyland tomorrow with my daughter. When I walk by that site, I will think this is the birthplace of the Eagles right here. And this is where Johnny Cash played. I always kind of flash back and think about what took place right there. And there we have them back then. Okay, you recognize that guy there? It's Meatloaf. So I was interviewing Meatloaf a couple of years ago, Mr. Loaf, and this picture I heard was taken on the Huntington Beach Pier. And so after our conversation, I took out this picture, and he gasped. And he said, oh my God, he goes, not only is that my first band picture, that's my first band. That was a band called Meatloaf Soul. He goes, I'll tell you this, he goes, there's a story behind that picture. He goes, that's the very first night I ever sang professionally and got paid money. I said, you're kidding me. He goes, no, he names the guys. It's the Huntington Beach Pier. He goes, that's our first official photo. And I assume, since they're in Huntington Beach, that they would have played where? The Golden Bear, which we'll get to, and I'm sure a lot of you know about. And he goes, no. We didn't play the Golden. He goes, I knew where the Golden Bear was because that was at the end of the pier. Because we played at a different place called The Cave. Now, The Cave used to be off of Beach Boulevard near Adams. And there's a little Mexican restaurant that kind of sits on the side today. And he told me that when he played there, he goes, we weren't the headliner. I said, well, this is talking about funny bills. He goes, we opened for Van Morrison and them. And he said, question mark and the Mysterians played before us, 96 Tears. And I'm thinking, you think you know everything. And now here you have Van Morrison, Meatloaf, and again, these stories sometimes it's the artists who fill these things in. Okay, the Everly Brothers, what you might not know, their breakup took place in Orange County at Knott's Berry Farm, 1972. They have a fight on stage. And the act disintegrates in Orange County. They don't talk for 10 years after this. But again, their fight happens in the middle of a show in Orange County. And again, it's just mind-boggling. All right, now I want to get to, in the mid-1970s, when arenas could no longer contain certain acts, you began to see this movement toward baseball stadiums. Really because of Bill Graham, the promoter, who started doing it up in the Bay Area. He had obviously run the Fillmore East and Fillmore West theaters. And what we have in Orange County now, Angel Stadium becomes a premier, in the 1970s, a premier concert venue, which was a really unique thing here. And we, Peter Frampton with Foghat and Jay Giles Band. This is right after Frampton Comes Alive comes out, speaking of him. We have, The Who in 1970, premiering Tommy there. Kiss, of course. Kiss, this was their very first stadium show. And I've talked to these guys at length about, meaning Gene and Paul, at length about this, and they cite this show as a very seminal moment in their career, where it was the first, they proved they could sell out. It wasn't just a shtick. They could sell out a ballpark. This was a big moment for them. And here we have the band America playing with the Beach Boys in 1976. The Rolling Stones have played there a number of times over the years. And what I want to show you really quick, I put together, this is just a very quick video. It's a couple of minutes, but you'll see The Who in 1970 playing at Angel Stadium. You'll see, I think Nazareth is on here. You'll see Kiss, a couple of other bands too. So check this out. I just thought this was cool because, again, I can't go to an Angels game and not think, Pink Floyd did Animals here. The Who did Tommy here. I get very spatially affected by history, kind of sensing of what took place there before. So here's just a very quick little montage, if this works. Young Pete Townsend. This is somebody's home movie, by the way. And they're playing on home plate. After this, most shows were out in the outfield. But when The Who, the very first concert there, which this is the first major show there, The Who played, you see Keith Moon there. Van Halen in 1978 at Angel Stadium. Flo and Eddie introducing Kiss at Angel Stadium in 1976. Flo and Eddie dressed up like members of Kiss that night. Nobody was here at this show, were they? Did you see the show? Kiss, of course, on their farewell tour now, like a lot of other artists. But they sold out. I mean, again, this was proof that they could actually pull this whole thing off. Let's see what's next here. I was a charter member of the KISS Army when I was 11 years old. I still have my membership card. Okay, what's next here? This is when Alice Cooper played there. Again, just interesting documentary footage of Angel Stadium being used as a concert venue. I want to scan through this just so I don't run out of time.
These people were part of a line that numbered 50,000.
That's Nazareth playing there, but the thing I wanted to show you.
In Anaheim tonight, one of the biggest stars.
Remember Jerry Dunphy?
Music came to town like this.
The legend. Picks up when Peter Frampton played there. There's Bill Graham introducing Peter Frampton at Angel Stadium.
What you heard there, 55,000 screaming fans waiting almost 8 hours for Peter Frampton's concert tonight.
So I guess the point is, as music was changing in the 70s, Orange County had all of the venues that you needed to take part. You had the baseball stadium, you had the Anaheim Convention Center, you had a host of clubs. So with that, I want to get to Elvis Presley briefly. So Elvis Presley, I live in Huntington Beach, and I give a writing class, memoir writing class at the new senior center there. And we always kind of start with this story because the senior center is next to the equestrian center. When Elvis Presley left Memphis in the late 60s to move to kind of full-time with Priscilla to Los Angeles, she wanted to bring horses out. She loved horses. And he said, well, you can do it, but you have to figure out how to board them, right? And she looks around and she boards them in Huntington Beach. So she would come down and take horseback riding lessons and keep her horses right on Golden Western, Huntington Beach. And he would come down once in a while too. I went and interviewed the families that owned the equestrian center. So where this goes, this is around the time when Elvis, who liked horses himself, there's Priscilla with the horses. In the early 70s, remember when Elvis got into like martial arts? That was like, I think I've got a picture of it here. Okay, so he wants to learn from the best. And Elvis learns, another Orange County story, there's a guy named Mike Stone. Mike Stone, if you remember, kind of pre-Chuck Norris, Mike Stone was the guy that sort of ushered in martial arts as kind of a pop culture force in the early 70s. And Elvis goes to him. He has a studio in Westminster. And Elvis says, I want you to be my teacher. And Mike Stone says, great. He goes, but I can't have you come to the studio. It'll be bedlam. Come to my house. He lived off of Edwards in Huntington Beach. And a little cul-de-sac, a little tract neighborhood. You come there and everything will be fine. So once a week, Elvis takes limo down from LA and he goes to Mike Stone's house and he gets his lessons. Now the kids on the street who I ended up tracked down and interviewed, they told me these stories about they would see this white limo pull down each week and they knew who was in the car. And Elvis got out the first time he went there to the kids and he says, look, we got to keep this a secret. You have my back, I'll have yours. And to that end, he would bring them signed albums. As long as they didn't blab about what was happening each week, they kind of kept it cool there for this year that Elvis was going down there to get trained, right? So Elvis loves Mike Stone. He senses, I think he became a black belt at some point. But when Elvis is hitting the road, he says to Priscilla, you know what, this guy is amazing. You've got to go take classes with him too. It's good for your mind, your body, your soul. She says, fine. So now Priscilla starts coming down. There's Mike Stone in action. Problem is, when Elvis is on the road, Priscilla's lessons take a slightly different path than the King's did. This is where the house was. Here's Edwards here. This is where it all goes down. This is where the Priscilla Presley, Mike Stone relationship starts to happen. Subsequently, she leaves Elvis. That's her with Mike Stone and Lisa Marie. Elvis's marriage falls apart in Huntington Beach in that house where she falls in love with Mike Stone and eventually leaves Elvis in, I think, 1972. That's the divorce. This is the relationship. It's over. I mean, again, this is like it or not, this is an Orange County story. It's part of our past here. Some other places, there was a place called Hungry Joe's in Huntington Beach on Coast Highway. Bonnie Raitt told me this was her favorite place to play back in the day. This optometry place on Beach Boulevard was a place called Camel Records in the 70s and 80s. And what's amazing is the number of in-store appearances. If you look at it's in the book. But so many bands from The Cure to U2 made in-store appearances at this little record store. They had a very enterprising guy that ran Camel Records. Again, I like just knowing in the space that's there today. And that's the same structure. There's a house. Who knows what happened in this garage? No doubt. This was Gwen Stefani's grandparents' house, and that garage is where their band formed. And again, there's a lot of bands that grew out of Orange County. The Aquabats, of course, Dave Mustaine from Megadeth went to Marina High School in Huntington Beach. Scott Weiland, Edison High School in Huntington Beach. We have lots of legends. Today, Avenged Sevenfold from Huntington Beach. And the Runaways. I have a story in the book about Sandy West's house in Huntington where the Runaways were formed. A real seminal female punk band in the mid-1970s. In fact, when she passed away, there's a marker for her down in Dana Point. That's Lita Ford visiting the memorial in Dana Point in her honor. a little bit in the book about the punk rock movement and how Orange County was so integral to that. And again, Huntington Beach had these places at the Meadowlark Country Club, and these were the wonderful days of these sort of DIY punk posters you'd see all over. This is really kind of helped to define what the whole scene was like. And, you know, the crowd was a very popular band. There was, you know, today if you go to these places, there was a place called Spats in Huntington Beach. I got to know the guys in Stone Temple Pilots. This is where they first played in Orange County. The place is no longer there, of course, but it's the Harbor Rackets, but that's the exact spot where all these concerts took place. Social Distortion, Night Moves, I mean, just amazing series of places. There was a place called Safari Sam's at Huntington Beach. If you know the surfing museum today, that's Safari Sam's. That's where first Jane's Addiction show ever, 10/24/1985, in that building that was at one time Safari Sam's. And that's a picture of a band playing there back then. Anybody ever go to the Cuckoo's Nest in Costa Mesa? Again, for several years, late 70s, early 80s, just a very important punk landmark. And then we had the bigger venues too. We had Irvine Meadows, which sadly is no longer there. You've got Pacific Amphitheater. Again, it's more to this idea that Orange County has always supported essentially any size band because of the number of interesting and relevant venues that we've had. Okay, so the Golden Bear, that's what I like to sort of end up talking about. Who went to the Golden Bear? Remember who you might have seen play there? You saw Linda Ronstadt there. Oh my God. How about you, John? Mike Bloomfield. Jorma Kaukonen. And who else went to the Golden Bear? Who did you see play there? Tower of Power. I mean,
The Birds and
the Birds. I mean, Golden Bear opened in 1927 as the Golden Bear Cafe. It was a well-to-do kind of place where celebrities would come down from LA and go, you know, seaside dining. But it closes in the 1930s. It opens and closes as the decades go on, but it really isn't dormant most of the time. When it reopens in the late 50s, it's in conjunction with the new burgeoning folk movement, and it becomes essentially a folk club in the early 1960s. That's what the Golden Bear looked like before it closed down. Through the years, Bob Dylan never played there. There's a lot of mythology about the Golden Bear. Not all of it's true. Jimi Hendrix never played there. People swear they saw him there, but he did not play there. Nor did Bob Dylan. But the Golden Bear did promote a Bob Dylan show at Wilson High School in Long Beach. So Dylan did get close there. That's a ticket from that show, actually. $4, $3, and $2. This is Steve Martin. Steve Martin played the Golden Bear. I had heard his story. I did a profile on him a number of years ago, and he told me the story where he verified it, that during one of his very early stand-up performances at the Golden Bear, part of the act was to have all 400 people. Think if we did this here tonight, double your amount. If I had you all get up and leave, what he did, he told everyone to get up and leave the club, which they did. And he brings them out on Coast Highway. And if you know where Duke's is today in Huntington, there was a hedgerow there. He has everybody duck down behind the bushes. And he says, on my cue, the next guy that walks past, you're going to collectively go up and scream and scare the shit out of him, which they did. And then he marched everybody back into the club and then resumed the show. So these are the kinds of experiences at the Golden Bear. And I like talking to artists who play there to relay these stories. I had heard a story about Peter Gabriel at the Golden Bear. I wasn't sure if it was true. His very first solo tour after leaving Genesis, a friend of mine said, you know what, I heard that he, at the end of the show, he kind of snuck out the back and crossed Coast Highway and went swimming, just stripped down and kind of went in the water and kind of had this moment, which is kind of a nice romantic thing. So I was doing a piece on Peter Gabriel. I go up to LA and I want to ask him about this, but I don't want to lay the story out there, because, you know, if you do that sometimes they may just say, well, yes or no. I wanted him to sort of fill in the details. So after we're done with the interview, he says to me, where are you from? And I said, Huntington Beach. I live in Huntington Beach. And he stops and he goes, Huntington Beach? He goes, the Golden Bear. And I'm like, really? So I want him to sort of continue. And I said, well, what about the Golden Bear, Peter? And he says, it's like he was looking off in the distance and he got lost in this memory. And he says, you know, he goes, we arrive early in the morning, and he goes, I go to a place called Jack's, you know, I buy a little thing called a boogie board. And my first time I'd ever bought a little board. And he begins telling this story about how he bought a little boogie board at Jack's Surfboards on the corner. He goes, the frustrating part was there was no time to go swimming. We had a sound check and this, I could do a record sign and all this sort of thing. He goes, I said, well, what happened? And he begins describing how, as the band was finishing the set, he did in fact leave, and he slips out the back. He goes, he's just beautifully describing this full moon at night. He goes across Coast Highway, takes all of his clothes off. He's got his board, and he can hear the band playing across the street. He can hear the show ending as he makes his way out. And again, whenever I go to the pier at Huntington, I think about Peter Gabriel all together under a full moon, enjoying kind of the surf. And it's a very kind of surreal thing. You look at everybody played there. Here, it's semi-typical week. B.B. King, The Dregs, Poco. I mean, just, Canned Heat, Elvin Bishop, Jesse Winchester, Don McLean. Everybody played the Golden Bear. This is the very last show at the Golden Bear. That's Robin Trower on stage, the last live moment before the place closed in 1986. Before it closed, a few years early in 1979, there was a young guy that used to hang out there at the Golden Bear, and he loved B.B. King. B.B. King would do residencies at the Golden Bear fairly frequently. And the owner, Rick Babaraki, used to see this guy. He was like a 20-year-old, and he always had a sketch pad at the Golden Bear. And Rick said to him one night, who are you? Like, what's your deal? And some of you may know this. And the kid says, well, I have an apartment around the corner. I want to be a muralist. That's what I like to do. I like to sketch. You would draw the musicians. And Rick says, well, look, I can't offer you money. He goes, we've got this brick face on the outside of the building. You can go paint that. That can be your first mural. Okay, and you'll never have to pay for another show here again. That's what I can offer you. And so the next day he goes out there and he begins painting. These are right before the Golden Bear was taken down. These were like sculptures in the back. But anyhow, the painter goes out there and begins painting on the side of the building his idea of artists that have played there. And you can kind of see there were big musical notes he painted. This is after it was kind of graffitied. And, he painted Linda Ronstadt, and this is right before the club was torn down. But when he finished the painting, Rick says, well, wait a minute, you didn't sign your name on the painting. And so you see Jimi Hendrix there, Janis Joplin. And so he adds his name, Weiland. 1979. This was Weiland's first mural. And from the reaction, I know you know who Weiland is. And it's so funny because he never had Weiland never had a photo of his name on the building, which I gave him. I had one printed and framed a couple of years ago. And he's an amazing guy. I mean, he's just very philanthropic and does, real amazing work to help the environment and help the arts and all that. But that was his first painting on the side of the Golden Bear. So with that, I do a television show called It Happened Here on the Reels channel, where if you like this kind of stuff, this is what I talk about. Well, we did 10 episodes, and I saw the Andy Warhol one last night. It's my favorite one. But what we do in each episode, in each hour, we take a personality like Andy Warhol or Marvin Gaye or whomever, and we trace their life through their footsteps, through the places they touched. We go where John Lennon met Paul McCartney at that church. So this to me is all part of, it's an extension of this kind of talk about going and finding places where things happened, where the air feels a little bit thicker, where it feels a little bit different and unique. And again, if you're interested in this kind of thing, I think you might like this show. The Janis Joplin episode was really good. If you ever go to the room up at the hotel where she died, we did an episode in there. And this was a really haunting one in room 105, but that's me sitting on the bed. She died on the bed right back there. But what's interesting, what I love about that hotel is whoever stays there, they encourage you to write in the closet your memories to Janis Joplin. So they create this kind of living shrine to her there. And with that, I want to leave you one other thing. We'll take some questions in a minute, but I have a book coming out, a music-related book this fall that I thought you might be interested in. This is like a 1-minute trailer to it. It's not a rock and roll book per se, but there's a lot of rock and roll stories in it. And I've written like 30 books. This, to me, this is the one that almost killed me, honestly. But I'm super proud of it. Is it okay to share it? We'll get questions in a second. It's only about a minute long, but just to give you a little taste of what's coming up in November. Remember Leif Garrett?
I'll tell you, he seems to be really popular with a lot of girls.
Swimming fans, fame and fortune.
Ladies and gentlemen, Leif Garrett.
what, brother? You're a big hit now. You're making money and all sorts of good things are happening.
The last single we had was the biggest selling single of the year.
You've made a fortune, you lost a fortune, you've been on the top, you've been on the bottom. Would you do it all over again if you had the chance?
Oh, man.
I didn't have to work for anything. It was just sort of given to me because of the way I looked and things like that. And I never really felt that I earned it, you know? And I wasn't really a singer to begin with. I became a good singer, I think, and I think that I became a good stage performer.
Do you think you earned it now? Do you look back and
do.
go, hang on, I
I
worked
really
really
do.
hard?
I really do.
Anyway, that's this fall, so November, actually, not December. So, and I thank you all for hanging with me tonight. I know I ramble a little bit, but thanks for sticking with me. And again, if you heard a little something tonight that interests you, pass it along. That's how these things will continue. So thanks very much. I appreciate it.